Hello, my friends. My name is Maria, and I will now read you a story. So, settle in and listen. A big ship lay there with 3 masts. She had all her sails spread, for there was not a breath of wind, and the sailors were sitting in the rigging and on some of the yards. There was music and singing on board, and as the evening closed in, hundreds of Chinese lanterns of all colors were lighted. It looks as if all the flags of the world were fluttering in the air. The little mermaid swam right up to the window of the great cabin in the stern, and every time a wave lifted her up, she could see through the crystal windows. There were many splendidly dressed people in it, but the handsomest of all was a young prince with large black eyes. He could hardly be more than 16. It was his birthday. The sailors danced on deck, and when the young prince came forth, hundreds of rockets started into the air. They were as bright as day, and the little mermaid became so frightened she dived under the water. But when she a moment after rose again, it seemed to her as if all the stars of heaven were falling. She had never before seen such a magic fire display. Big suns wheeled around, while magnificent serpents of fire darted through the blue air, and all was reflected in the calm crystal sea. On the ship itself, it was so light that every cord was visible besides the people. Oh, how handsome the young prince was! And he shook hands with everybody and laughed and talked while the music sounded in the lovely night. It grew late, but the little mermaid could not turn her eyes from the ship and the handsome prince. The colored lanterns were put out, no more rockets rose into the air, and the guns were silent. But far down in the sea there was a rumbling, sullen noise. She lay still in the water, rocking up and down, so that she could look into the cabin. But now the ship began to move swifter. Sail after sail was filled, and the waves rose high. Dark clouds came rolling up, and far away it began to lighten. Oh, a terrible storm was approaching. Therefore the sailors began to shorten sail. The big ship rolled madly in the wild sea. The waves rose like big dark mountains, which threatened to sweep over the masts, but the vessel dived like a swan between them, rising again on their towering crests. The little mermaid just thought it a delightful race, but not so the sailors. The vessel creaked and strained. The thick planks were bulged out by the heavy shocks of the sea. The mast snapped like a reed, and the ship heeled over so that the water filled the hold. The little mermaid saw that they were in danger, and she too had to take care of the spars and splints floating about. One moment it was so pitch dark she could see nothing, but in the next, when there was a flash of lightning, it became so light she could see everything on board. Everyone tried to save himself, but she thought the young prince in particular, and when the ship broke to pieces, she saw him sink into the deep waters. At first she was very glad because he would come down to her. But then she remembered that men could not live in the water, and that only his dead body would reach her father's place. No, die he should not. So she swam in between the spars and planks floating about, entirely forgetting they might crush her, dived very deep and rose again until she was close to the young prince, who was hardly able to keep himself above water in the terrible sea. His arms and legs began to grow heavy, his pretty eyes closed, and he would have been drowned had not the little mermaid come to his aid. She held his head above the water and let the waves carry them both along. By the morning the storm had passed, and of the ship there was no trace. The sun rose red and shining from the sea, and it seemed to bring life into the cheeks of the prince, but his eyes remained closed. The mermaid kissed his fine high forehead and turned back his wet hair. She thought he was like the marble statue down in her little garden, and she kissed him repeatedly and wished he might live. Now she saw land before her, high blue mountains on the tops of which white snow glistened as if it was a flock of swans. By the shore there were beautiful green woods, and in front lay a church or convent, she could not say which, but it was some building. Lemon and orange trees grew in the garden, and before the gate stood tall palm trees. The sea formed a small bay here, calm and quiet, but very deep, right up to the rocks where the fine white sand was heaped up. So she swam there with the handsome prince and laid him on the sand with his head high in the warm sunshine. Just then the bells in the great white building sounded, and many young girls came walking through the garden. Then the little mermaid swam farther out behind some big stones rising above water, threw foam over her hair and breast so that nobody could see her face, and began to watch what became of the poor prince. It was not long before a young girl came. She appeared to be frightened, but only for a moment. She ran at once for assistance, and the mermaid saw the prince reviving and laughed to those around him. But to her he did not laugh, for, of course, he did not know she had saved him. She felt quite a pang when he was taken into the big house and dived sadly into the sea and went home to her father's palace. She had always been quiet and thoughtful, but now she became still more so. Her sisters asked her what she had seen in the first time she ascended, but she related nothing. Many a night and morning she rose to where she had left the prince. She saw the fruit in the garden ripen and gathered. She saw the snow melt on the lofty mountains, but she saw not the prince, and therefore she always returned home more sad at heart. Here it was her only consolation to sit in her little garden with her arms round the pretty statue, which was like the prince, but she cared not for her flowers. They grew wild in the path and twined their long tendrils and leaves into the boughs of the trees, so that it was nearly dark there. At last she could bear it no longer, but confided her secret to one of her sisters, and soon all the others knew it, but nobody else besides a few other mermaids who only told it to a few intimate friends. One of them knew who the prince was, and had even seen the festivities on board the ship, and knew where he came and where his kingdom lay. "Come, little sister," the other princess said, and with their arms entwined they rose to the surface of the sea, just where they knew the palace of the prince stood.